The suitcase sat by my front door, as if waiting to bury me alive. Its brown leather was cracked with age, the brass clasps glinting like cold eyes. Morning light spilled across the floor, touching the photograph of a woman I could never stop loving. Somewhere in the quiet, a clock ticked loud enough to feel like a countdown, and then I saw the note, with my name but not in my own handwriting. I knelt beside the suitcase, the leather breathing out a faint scent of dust and old journeys. The slip of paper jutting from the side was creased, the ink scrawled in a hand that trembled. Only, it wasn't mine. My pulse quickened, a slow drumbeat in my ears, as I turned it over and read, Julian Morrow, Willow Crest Living Center. The letters felt foreign in my mouth, like they belonged to someone else's fate. The house was too still. My voice echoed back at me when I called out for Clara, though I knew she wasn't here. From a mantel, a photograph watched me. My late wife, Lucia. Her smile froze in the moment before time and illness carried her away. She wore the green dress she'd insisted on for my 65th birthday, the last we spent together. She'd baked her famous almond cake with hands that already shook, dusting flour across her cheek, like some gentle act of rebellion against a sickness. I gripped the kitchen counter to steady myself, but the memories pressed harder. The suitcase seemed heavier now, though I hadn't touched it. Clothes bulged at its corners, none of which I remembered choosing. Something inside me resisted the message on that slip of paper. I thought of baking that same almond cake today, of setting the table for family, of pretending the fractures in our lives could still be sealed with sugar and tradition. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, the crunch of tires on the driveway drew me to the window. A silver sedan rolled to a stop, my daughter in the passenger seat, her husband at the wheel. They didn't look at the house, didn't look at me, just sat there as if waiting for a reluctant passenger. Behind me, the almond cake cooled untouched, its scent clinging to the air like a plea. In front of me, that suitcase loomed at the door, silent and certain. Something in my chest shifted, a splintering I couldn't quite name. I knew, without anyone saying a word, that whatever was coming next was not a celebration. And the worst part? I had a feeling they'd already decided it would happen, whether I walked willingly or was carried. I opened the door before they could knock. Clara's hug was thin, her perfume sharp enough to sting my eyes. Beside her, Mason gave me a handshake that felt more like a transaction, his gaze slipping past me to the suitcase like it was all ready as to move. I gestured toward the kitchen, the warm scent of almond and cinnamon spilling out like a final peace offering. Your mother's recipe, I said quietly. Come in. Sit. I've set the table. There's no time, Dad, Clara cut in, her smile too bright, too practiced. Mason was already lifting the suitcase without asking, the straps creaking under the weight of clothes I didn't choose. The air in the doorway felt tighter with every passing second, as though the house itself sensed it was about to lose one of its own. They walked ahead toward the car while I lingered in the doorway, my eyes catching on the small details. Lucia's rose-shaped embroidery on the dining napkins, the porch swing we used to watch summer storms from, the door frame etched with years of pencil marks tracking Clara's height. The sedan's trunk opened with a hollow thud, and the suitcase slid inside like a body sealed away. The drive was quiet but not peaceful. Mason kept the music just loud enough to smother conversation. I watched the streets pass, shops where I'd fixed shelves for neighbors, the old theater where Lucia and I once danced under flickering lights, the park where Clara had begged for another 5 minutes on the swings. Each landmark felt like it was waving goodbye without me waving back. When we turned off the main road, the scenery changed, manicured hedges, sterile glass buildings, a sign ahead in polished steel letters. Willow Crest Living Center, where new chapters begin. My stomach tightened. Clara finally turned, her voice light, almost rehearsed. Surprise! Dad, this is your new home. The words hit harder than I'd imagined. In the reflection of the car window, I saw the house I'd left behind fade from my mind's eye, and the truth settle in its place. They weren't bringing me somewhere to visit. They were bringing me somewhere to disappear. The sedan rolled under the arched canopy, its shadow swallowing the last of the daylight. Behind glass doors, a few residents sat in wheelchairs, their gazes fixed somewhere far beyond the manicured lawns. Mason killed the engine without a word, stepping out to retrieve the suitcase as if the moment had been rehearsed. Clara's hand brushed my arm, not in comfort, but to guide me forward, like a passenger being escorted onto the last train out. I stepped onto the walkway, the air too clean, too filtered, carrying none of the earth and rain I was used to breathing in my garden. The glass doors parted automatically, and a wave of sterilized air pressed against my face. Inside, polished floors reflected the overhead lights. Each step I took echoing like a final verdict. The smell of antiseptic clung to the air, masking whatever life might have existed here before. At the reception desk, a woman in pastel scrubs smiled, as though I were a guest checking into a seaside resort. Clara spoke for me, signing papers with swift, practiced strokes, her voice dipping low when the receptionist nodded in understanding. I caught fragments: accommodations, transition, extended stay. Every word sounded like a chain tightening around my ankles. I turned to Clara, searching her face for hesitation, for doubt, for anything that resembled the girl who once fell asleep on my chest after thunderstorms. But her eyes darted away, focusing instead on the elevator that would take me somewhere upstairs. Mason stood behind her, holding my suitcase like a trophy. For a moment, I considered walking out, stepping into the fading light, and leaving them standing here with their careful lies and polished intentions. But I knew something they didn't. This wasn't over, and the first move would be mine. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a hallway lined with muted beige walls and framed prints of landscapes that could belong to anywhere or nowhere at all. The carpet muffled every footstep, yet I could still hear the wheels of my suitcase rattling behind Mason. Each sound was a reminder that this was not a visit, but a handover. A staff member, mid-40s, tired eyes hidden behind a polite smile, introduced herself as Elena, my transition coordinator. She spoke in a practiced rhythm, pointing out the meal schedule, activity rooms, emergency buttons. Her voice was warm enough to be disarming, but too measured to feel real. I listened, but every word slipped past me, replaced by the pulse of one thought. They've already decided I belong here. When she unlocked the door to my assigned room, I felt my chest tighten. A single bed pressed against the far wall, its white sheets tucked with military precision. A dresser that looked as though it had been assembled yesterday and forgotten immediately after. One narrow window facing the parking lot, enough to see Clara's silver sedan waiting outside like an accomplice lingering at the scene. Elena excused herself, leaving me in the stillness. I opened the suitcase, peeling back the zipper as if I might find some proof this was all a mistake. Instead, I found clothes I hadn't worn in years, socks with thinning heels, and shirts that still carried the faint smell of mothballs. Missing were the things that mattered: Lucia's locket, the leather-bound journals where decades of designs and notes were stored, the photographs of summers that felt endless. Gone. All of them. A cold realization crept over me, sharper than any betrayal before. This move wasn't about care or safety or even convenience. This was about erasing me, piece by piece, until there was nothing left worth remembering. And if they thought I would fade quietly into the beige walls of this place, they didn't know me at all. I sat on the edge of the narrow bed, the mattress sighing beneath my weight, like it knew it wasn't mine. My hands rested on my knees, knuckles pale, mind sifting through the empty spaces where my life used to be. The missing locket, the journals, the photographs, they weren't just objects. They were proof that I had lived, loved, built something worth leaving behind. Without them, I was just another nameless occupant in a building that smelled of bleach and resignation. The sun was sinking beyond the small window, spilling a thin wash of amber across the sterile walls. Down in the parking lot, Clara's sedan idled for a moment before gliding away, Mason at the wheel. They didn't look up, didn't wave, didn't turn back. The red glow of their taillights lingered against the glass, then vanished into the deepening dusk. I drew in a slow breath, forcing the air to steady the storm brewing inside me. They thought they'd brought me here to wither, box me into a room with no history, no voice. But there was a flaw in their plan, a blind spot they hadn't accounted for. I wasn't just an aging man with fading edges. I was the same mind that had solved problems no one else could, the The same hands that had built things from nothing. The same voice that once filled boardrooms with silence when I spoke. And in this silence now, I realized something Clara and Mason would never suspect. This place might have been chosen for me, but what happened next would be chosen by me. Night settled over Willow Crest like a slow-moving tide, swallowing the last threads of daylight. I stayed by the window, watching the parking lot lamps flicker to life, their yellow halos catching the occasional moth. Down below, a man in a wheelchair sat motionless near the fountain, the water glinting under artificial light. No one spoke to him. No one stopped. He was part of the furniture now. I let the curtain fall back into place and sat at the small desk. My fingers traced the surface, searching for some connection to my old life, but all I felt was the chill of laminate. The more I replayed Clara's face in my mind, the more the truth hardened. This wasn't about care or safety. This was about control. She and Mason had taken my possessions to strip me of identity, then placed me here to strip me of presence. But they'd miscalculated. I still had my mind, and more importantly, I still had reach. Contacts who owed me favors. People who understood the value of quiet, deliberate moves. If they wanted me tucked away, forgotten behind these beige walls, I would make sure the opposite happened. A plan began to form, sharp as glass in my mind. It wasn't just about getting my life back. It was about making sure theirs could never return to what it had been. My pulse steadied, my thoughts crystallized. If they believed they'd written the final chapter of my story, I would prove they'd only turned the first page. The next morning, sunlight slipped past the thin curtains, landing on the suitcase I still hadn't unpacked. It sat like a mute witness, holding the scraps of my life they deemed worth keeping. I stared at it for a long time before finally standing, the cool linoleum under my bare feet grounding me in this strange, borrowed reality. The corridor outside was already alive with soft shuffles and muted conversations. Residents moved like shadows, some glancing at me with curiosity, others too far inside themselves to notice. I passed an open lounge where a television murmured to an empty set of chairs, its flickering light spilling over the carpet like a faint heartbeat in a dying room. When I reached the administrative wing, the air shifted. Thicker carpet, warmer lighting, the faint scent of expensive coffee. I asked the facility director by name. The receptionist hesitated, then picked up the phone. Moments later, an office door opened and a man stepped out, his smile freezing halfway when he saw me. Recognition flickered in his eyes, not of who I was to my family, but of who I was beyond them. We shook hands, his grip damp with unease. I asked to see every piece of paperwork tied to my arrival. He hesitated, then slid a folder across the desk. One glance told me more than I needed. Signatures that weren't mine, evaluations from doctors I'd never met, authorizations I'd never given. My fingers traced the forged lines slowly, as if memorizing the shape of betrayal. I looked up, meeting his gaze. "This isn't just a mistake," I said quietly. "It's a crime." And from the way his face drained of color, I knew he understood that I intended to prove it. He slid the folder toward me, his fingers reluctant to let go, as though releasing it might also release a wave he couldn't control. I opened it slowly, each page turning with the weight of accusation. The forged power of attorney bore my name, but not my hand. The pen strokes were too clean, too steady. Whoever had done this didn't know the slight tremor I'd carried in my right wrist since Lucia's passing. Next came the so-called medical evaluation, stamped with a physician's name I had never heard. No examination dates, no medical history, no signatures of consent, just a neatly printed declaration that I was no longer capable of independent living. The more I read, the tighter my jaw became. Clara hadn't just orchestrated my removal. She had laid a paper trail to make it look like mercy. The director, Mr. Hanley, shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes darting toward the window as though the ocean view might save him from this conversation. "Mr. Morrow," he began, voice brittle, "we process hundreds of admissions a year. If mistakes were made, I assure you, they weren't intentional." I leaned forward, letting the silence between us stretch until it felt heavier than my words. "A mistake is a wrong turn on the road," I said. This is a destination you drove me to on purpose." His throat bobbed as he swallowed, and for a fleeting second, I saw it, fear. I gathered the papers into a single, incriminating stack and stood, my shadow spilling long across his desk. "You're going to want to keep your schedule clear," I told him, "because the people I call next will want to hear how a place like this admits someone on forged documents." And the way his hand froze halfway to his coffee cup told me he knew exactly how far this could go. I walked out of Hanley's office with a folder tucked under my arm, the weight of it pressing against my ribs like a loaded weapon. The hallway outside seemed different now. Not just sterile walls and muffled footsteps, but a map of possibilities. Every door I passed whispered with the lives of people who might have been placed here the same way I had been. Some sat staring at silent televisions. Others clutched framed photographs like talismans. They weren't here for care. They were here because someone decided they were easier to manage out of sight. Back in my room, I closed the door, set the folder on the desk, and reached for my phone. My fingers hesitated only for a heartbeat before scrolling to names I hadn't called in years. Old colleagues, legal contacts, people who remembered what I had built and who I had been before Clara's careful script tried to rewrite me. When the first voice answered, deep, steady, and instantly familiar, the years between us vanished. I laid out the facts, every forged signature, every stolen item, every calculated lie. By the time I ended the call, the plan was already in motion. Documents would be examined, bank records pulled, warrants prepared, and when the truth surfaced, it wouldn't just splash. It would drown the people who had tried to erase me. I sat back, the late afternoon sun spilling across the floor, catching on the brass corners of the suitcase. The air felt different, lighter, charged. Clara and Mason believed they had closed the door behind me. What they didn't realize was that they had locked themselves in with a man who knew exactly how to pick it open. That night, I didn't sleep. The moonlight pooled across the floor like silver ink, outlining the edges of the folder on my desk. Every so often, I'd hear the distant hum of the elevator or the slow creak of a wheelchair in the corridor. This place never truly slept. It only rested between routines that kept its occupants subdued. I sat by the narrow window, phone in hand, watching headlights sweep in and out of the parking lot below. Each incoming car made me wonder who was arriving willingly and who, like me, had been delivered here under the guise of care. My thoughts kept circling back to Clara's voice. Sweet on the surface, laced with steel underneath. She believed this building would swallow me whole, file me away as a manageable burden. She hadn't counted on me making the walls shift. By morning, the first calls had already been returned. Legal counsel confirmed the forged documents were admissible evidence. A private investigator I'd trusted for years was already digging into property records and bank transfers. Even the facility's own security system, those silent black domes tucked into corners, would become witnesses once the footage was pulled. I pressed my palm to the cold glass, feeling the faint vibration of the world moving beyond this place. Soon, the same hands that carried my suitcase here would be carrying boxes of their own. Only theirs wouldn't be filled with clothes. They'd be filled with consequences. By mid-morning, the corridors hummed with a rhythm I hadn't noticed before. Staff moving in deliberate patterns, residents shuffling toward scheduled activities, the faint clink of breakfast trays being cleared away. I moved among them like a shadow, the folder of evidence tucked discreetly beneath my arm. Every face I passed told a fragment of the same story. Someone had decided their voice no longer mattered. At the far end of the hall, the conference room waited, its door propped open just enough for the scent of fresh coffee to spill out. Inside, Hanley sat with two senior staff members, their quiet conversation faltering the moment I stepped in. I set the folder down on the polished table, the sound sharp enough to make them flinch. "You'll want to review this before the authorities do," I said evenly, sliding the forged documents toward them. Their eyes scanned the pages, their expressions shifting from skepticism to alarm. The silence that followed wasn't the polite kind. It was the kind that comes when people realize the ground beneath them is about to give way. I leaned forward, letting my voice drop just enough to cut through the room like a blade. This facility is now part of an ongoing investigation. You can cooperate or be listed among the names on the complaint. Hanley swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw tightening. I could see the calculation in his eyes. How quickly could he distance himself from the mess that had just landed in his lap, leaving them to their panic? I stepped back into the hallway. The hum of the building hadn't changed, but the air felt different now, charged, unsettled. Somewhere out there, Clara still believed she was winning. That belief wouldn't survive the week. That afternoon, the first wave of calls began to ripple outward. The attorney I'd contacted confirmed that subpoenas were being drafted. A contact of the State Oversight Board promised an unannounced inspection of Willow Crest within 48 hours. Even the investigator had news. Property listings showing my house had already been appraised, its value neatly penciled into notes alongside projected liquidation timelines. The arrogance of it burned hotter than anger. It was greed dressed as inevitability. I sat in a lounge, pretending to read while residents shuffled past, unaware that the air around us was shifting. Through the glass doors, I watched a courier in a navy windbreaker deliver a thick envelope to the reception desk. Hanley appeared minutes later, tearing it open in full view of his staff. The color drained from his face as he read. He didn't look toward me, but I saw the stiffness in his shoulders, the small, controlled movements of a man trying not to appear cornered. In the early evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the parking lot in copper light, I stepped outside. The breeze carried the scent of pine from the hills beyond the facility, grounding me in something larger than this place, larger than their schemes. I imagined Clara, phone in hand, thinking she still had time to maneuver. She didn't know the clock had already run out. I turned back toward the entrance, catching my reflection in the glass. Older, yes, but not broken. Not by them. Not by this. If they thought I was just an aging man boxing to his final chapter, they were about to discover that I was also the one holding the pen. The next morning arrived with a knock at my door. Not the polite tap of a nurse checking in, but the firm rap of someone with a purpose. When I opened it, Elena stood there, her usual measured smile replaced by something taut, uneasy. "Mr. Morrow," she said quietly, "Hanley would like to see you in his office." Immediately, the walk there felt different than before. Staff members glanced up as I passed, then quickly looked away, whispers trailing in my wake. Even the residents seemed to sense a shift, their eyes following me longer than usual, as if they knew I was carrying something heavier than the weight of my years. Hanley was standing when I entered, the folder I'd given him yesterday now joined by another, thicker stack of documents. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, knuckles pale. "You've attracted quite a bit of attention in the last 24 hours, he said, his voice deliberately neutral. "We had inquiries from the State Board, from the licensing department, even from a detective in Westboro." He paused, studying me as though trying to read a move before it was made. I took a seat without asking. "Then I'd say the process is working exactly as intended." The faint tick in his jaw betrayed the strain behind his calm. He slid one of the new documents toward me. A printed email chain, my daughter's name appearing again and again alongside Mason's. Words like sale contract, expedited transfer, and funding gap leapt off the page. It was all there in black and white. For a long moment, I just stared at the pages, feeling each line sink like a stone into deep water. Then I looked up, meeting Hanley's eyes without flinching. "You might want to clear your calendar," I told him, "because when this storm breaks, it won't be polite enough to knock before it comes through your door." Hanley's lips tightened, as if my words had lodged somewhere between his pride and his fear. "Mr. Morrow," he began carefully, "if this goes the way you think it will, there will be collateral damage for everyone." I leaned back in the chair, folding my hands over a folder of evidence. "Collateral damage," I repeated softly, letting the phrase hang in the air. "You mean accountability." "And yes, there will be plenty of that." A flicker of unease crossed his face. I could see it now, the weight of the institution pressing down on him, the awareness that once this moved beyond these walls, he wouldn't be able to hide behind procedure or polite denials. He tried to regain footing, flipping to printed emails, his voice dropping. "Some of these, they imply your daughter acted with intent. If law enforcement interprets them that way, they will, I interrupted, my tone leaving no room for doubt. Because that's exactly what happened. Silence stretched between us, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioner. I could feel the balance shifting in the room, the control slipping from him with every beat. Finally, Hanley closed the file and set aside, as if distancing himself from something already toxic. I rose slowly, the chair legs scraping against the floor. When the truth hits daylight, I said, stepping toward the door, you'll either be the one who helped expose it or the one standing in its shadow. I didn't wait for his reply. Out in the hallway, the building felt different, like a stage moments before the curtain rises. Every player in position, the audience holding its breath. And somewhere beyond these walls, Clara was still walking around as if she hadn't already lost. The next 48 hours moved like a fuse burning towards something inevitable. Word of the investigation spread, quietly at first, hushed conversations in corners, staff glancing over their shoulders, a few residents asking careful questions they hadn't dared before. By the second day, the air inside Willow Crest felt charged, as though everyone could sense a storm pressing against the glass. I spent the morning in my room, the folder of evidence open on the desk, reviewing it with the same precision I once reserved for contracts worth millions. Every page told the same story. Betrayal disguised as care, greed wrapped in the language of responsibility. Clara and Mason hadn't just plotted my removal, they'd plotted my erasure. And now, each line of their own emails, each falsified signature, was a step toward their undoing. By late afternoon, a dark sedan pulled into the parking lot. 2 plainclothes officers stepped out, their movements calm but deliberate. From my window, I watched them cross the lobby, flash their badges, and disappear down the hall toward Hanley's office. 10 minutes later, a courier arrived with another sealed envelope, this one marked urgent in red block letters. Staff began to whisper openly now, their voices carrying fragments, warrants, confiscation, audit. I knew, with a clarity that settled deep in my bones, that the next knock on my door wouldn't be another staff member asking me to sign a form. It would be someone carrying the weight of truth into the light. And when that moment came, the people who had believed they'd buried me here would finally see just how dangerous it is to leave a man alive with a story to tell. The knock came just after dusk, firm and unhurried, the kind that doesn't ask for permission so much as announce inevitability. When I opened the door, 2 detectives stood there, their badges catching the light from a hallway. The taller of the 2 spoke first, his tone polite but weighted. Mr. Morrow, we'd like to ask you a few questions before we speak with the administration. I stepped aside, letting them in, the quiet hum of the corridor fading as the door clicked shut. They moved with a calm efficiency, setting a recorder on the desk, opening a leather-bound folder. I told them everything. The missing items, the forged paperwork, the conversations I'd overheard, the calculated way Clara had stripped the life from my home before she stripped me from it. Their pens moved steadily, but their eyes told me they already had most of this in hand. Halfway through, the shorter detective slid a photograph across the table. It was my dining room, the one in the house Clara thought I'd never see again. On it were neatly arranged evidence bags, Lucia's locket, my journals, stacks of old photographs. Recovered this morning, he said. We also have your bank security footage showing unauthorized withdrawals, and the emails you provided have been authenticated. I sat back, the weight in my chest shifting from anger to something sharper, resolve. Then you know this wasn't negligence. It was a plan. The taller detective nodded once, slow and certain. Yes, sir, and now it's our plan. He closed the folder, the sound landing like a gavel in the still room. We'll be speaking to Miss Bennett and her husband tonight. As they left, I caught my reflection in the darkened window. Not the man they tried to discard, but the one who had just set the first real stone in a wall they wouldn't be able to climb. Night fell heavy over Willow Crest, the kind of darkness that seems to hold its breath before a storm. From my window, the parking lot lay under the yellow glow of lampposts, but the real weight was in the air, thick with a sense that something irreversible had already begun. The detective's visit hadn't just shaken the walls here. It cracked them wide enough for daylight to find its way in. in the lounge. A few residents lingered by the silent television, their eyes flicking toward me as I passed. I could feel the quiet shift, the way whispers paused when I drew near, the way staff glanced at me and then at each other, as if wondering how much I knew, or worse, how much I'd already set in motion. The truth was, they were right to wonder. Back in my room, the phone vibrated against the desk. It was my attorney. "They've been served," he said without preamble. "Police are on their way to execute the search warrants at your daughter's house and the coffee shop. By tomorrow morning, this will be public." The words landed with the weight of a door closing, not on me, but on them. I hung up and sat in the stillness, hearing only the faint hum of the building's heating system. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed hard enough to echo down the corridor. It was coming, the confrontation, the unmasking, and when it arrived, there would be no way back for anyone involved. I stood at the window, looking out at the black stretch of road beyond the gates, my reflection caught against the glass. This was no longer about reclaiming what they'd stolen. It was about making sure they could never take again. The call came just after sunrise, sharp and clear through the quiet of my room. My attorney's voice carried an energy I hadn't heard in years. "They're in custody," he said. "Both of them. Arrested at their home before they could move or hide anything. The press is already outside." I sat on the edge of bed, the words sinking in like a deep breath after too long underwater. Through the thin curtains, the sky was painted in soft gold, a dawn that didn't feel borrowed anymore. It felt earned. Below, the parking lot was busier than usual. 2 marked police cars idled by the entrance, their light bars dark, but their presence impossible to ignore. An hour later, the news broke on the lounge television. The image of Clara, my own daughter, flashed across the screen, her hands cuffed in front of her, Mason just behind with his face turned away from the cameras. The reporter's voice cut to the murmurs of the residents gathered around. Charges include fraud, theft, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Each word felt like a gavel strike. The staff tried to keep their faces neutral, but I caught the sideways glances, the realization that the man they thought had been discarded was now the center of a storm. And then, without warning, my phone buzzed with a new call. The name on the screen stopped me cold. "Clara." I answered, saying nothing at first. Her voice was small, stripped of the certainty she'd worn like armor. "Dad, please. This isn't what it looks like. We can fix this." I closed my eyes, the image of my stripped home flickering in my mind. The empty shelves, the missing locket, the suitcase I hadn't packed. "You were right about one thing," I said, my voice steady. "We can fix this, but not together." I ended the call before she could speak again, and in that silence I knew the reckoning wasn't over. It had only just begun. The news cycle didn't let go. For days, every channel, every headline carried their names. Footage of them being escorted into the courthouse played on repeat. Clara shielding her face in the cameras. Mason wearing that same half-smile he used to disguise discomfort, now looking more like a man trying to pretend the ground beneath him wasn't splitting open. Here at Willowcrest, the mood had shifted. Residents I'd never spoken to stopped me in the halls, some with cautious smiles, others with eyes that carried quiet gratitude. They weren't congratulating me. They were thanking me for proving that people like us weren't as powerless as the world liked to think. Even the staff had changed, moving with a little more care, speaking with a little more respect. Hanley, for his part, avoided me entirely. I suspected he was spending more time with his lawyer than in his office. One afternoon, my attorney called with an update. "The courts granted a temporary freeze on the sale of your property, and everything taken from your home, every item, is in police custody, to be returned as soon as it clears evidence review." The relief was there, but muted, wrapped in something heavier. Because this was never just about my possessions. It was about taking back the space I'd been written out of. That evening, I stood at my window, looking out over the parking lot as the last light bled into the horizon. In my reflection, I saw not the man they'd tried to discard, but someone sharper, steadier. A survivor who'd stopped surviving and started reclaiming. And as the night settled in, one thought crystallized so clearly it felt like a promise. They'd taken me out of my home, but they'd never take me out of the fight. Weeks later, I was standing in my own kitchen again. The air felt different here, warmer, alive with a faint scent of wood polish and the rosemary plant I thought had died in my absence. The walls held my photographs again, the shelves my books, each one a piece of the life I'd fought to reclaim. Lucia's locket sat on the counter beside a folded tea towel, as if it had been waiting for me all along. The sun poured through the windows, catching the dust motes as they drifted lazily in the air. On the stove, a cherry pie cooled, its aroma wrapping around the room like an embrace from the past. I set 2 plates on the table, one for me, one for memory, because this house wasn't just 4 walls or roof. It was the last place where she and I had shared laughter, the last place that still knew the sound of her voice. When the doorbell rang at exactly 2 o'clock, I opened to find my grandson, Alex, standing there, taller than I remembered, carrying a notebook under his arm. His hug was firm, real, the kind that leaves no space of doubt. "I want to learn," he said simply. "Everything you can teach me. About the foundation, about how to fight for people who can't fight for themselves." We spent the afternoon at the table, pie cooling between us, as I unfolded the blueprints of a future that would outlast both of us. Beyond the window, the garden stirred in the breeze, and somewhere in the distance, I thought I heard Lucia's voice in the rustle of leaves. Use what we built. Make it matter. By the time the sun began to sink, painting the kitchen in gold, I realized something. They had tried to take my dignity, my voice, my place in the world, and in doing so, they had given me something far greater, a reason to rise every morning, a reason to keep building, because they hadn't written the last chapter of my story. I had,